Hi, this is my review of the D.READ HOUSE. The D.READ HOUSE is a difficult to define type of module because it's so many things. At its essence, I guess you could say that it's a mega campaign or mega adventure, perhaps, if you want to stretch out the point that the D.READ HOUSE is more like an entity rather than a place that transcends time and place. And in this review, I will be reviewing the D.READ HOUSE itself, that is the book featuring the module itself, but I will also review the Game Master screen inserts, the printable floor tiles, and the D.READ HOUSE, the D.READ Wedding Music Suite. Those are available separately. They are not necessary to run the D.READ HOUSE, but as you will see, they actually enhance the entire D.READ HOUSE experience. So what exactly is the D.READ HOUSE? Let's further define this. The D.READ HOUSE is a set of campaigns. You have two complete campaigns and a mini campaign that serves as a prequel to one of the campaigns. All of these campaigns can be connected into a huge campaign. You also have a set of standalone adventures, but pretty much every adventure and encounter can be used as a standalone experience or to add to your existing campaign. However, considering that the D.READ HOUSE also contains two complete adventure hubs, that is a village and a city, it could also be considered a mini campaign setting. The D.READ HOUSE also contains many tables, optional rules and features that you could use in any horror themed adventure, especially those adventures or campaigns that have ghosts at its center or as its vortex. So in that regard, it's also a toolkit. And the most interesting thing perhaps about the D.READ HOUSE module is that it's playable with the Pathfinder role-playing game, with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and you can also play this using the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition role-playing game. So this is a very versatile, very flexible adventure module, and I think it's worth it to convert it to other systems as well. If it's a system that derives from one of these three main systems, it's going to be even easier. But I think it won't be too difficult to convert it to, for example, Savage Worlds, perhaps even GURPS. You would just need to make the necessary arrangements. Any of those universal systems could work. It's just important to keep in mind that the more your system of choice differs from Pathfinder or 5th edition or Call of Cthulhu, you'll have to put a lot more work into it. Now, let's talk about the quality of the different features of the D.READ HOUSE. Let's start with the optional things. First, we have the D.READ HOUSE, the D.READ Wedding Music Suite. I will be playing some bits of this music suite during the course of this review, and the music is quite haunting, enchanting, with a bit of melancholy to it. Sometimes there are some upbeat or joyful moments within the song, but there is always that lingering threat that something is not quite right, just a bare hint. And near the end you do have some cacophonous or extravagant moments where you see that the song is reaching a certain crescendo or the climax of the adventure. So I think it fits the D.READ HOUSE quite well, specifically the D.READ Wedding, because this suite is for you to run the D.READ Wedding and play it alongside it. But you could also, if you wanted to, if you wanted a specific way of using the music suite, you could also separate it by different time frames so that you use a certain part in a specific scene or encounter. But I think if you want to run it just alongside the adventure with no care or control as to where or when a specific part of the song is going to play, it's going to work well too. And you will have this nice haunted house type of music that you can use in future adventures unrelated to this adventure module. It's going to be generic enough to use it in any adventure featuring horror and dread. I think that what I like the most about the music is that it's flexible enough to be used in any other type of horror adventure, but at the same time It tells you the story of the Dread Wedding, how it starts pretty moody, somewhat suspenseful, then things start to pick up, probably featuring the main battle near the end of the adventure, and then it reaches the resolution. Now let's talk about the printable floor tiles. These tiles, of course, will be able to represent all of the rooms, all of the areas of the Dread House. They look elegant and also quite old, like this building has not been habited for a long time. You can almost see the dust. There are many types of rugs and wooden planks. You can also see the features of the wall, windows. There are also some fireplaces, some statues and laboratory tables. My only criticism of the printable floor tiles is that some of the statues and the tables for the underground type of area, they look a bit pixelated. Maybe from afar it won't be that noticeable, but if you get really close, you will notice the pixelation. It would be great if that is fixed in the future, perhaps in an update. But nonetheless, the different floorings, embellishments, and all sorts of features composing the different rooms of the Dread House will allow players to feel that separation or division between the different sections and areas and rooms, but it won't feel disconnected from the theme of the haunted house. And there are a lot of tiles too that are quite versatile. The underground areas and in general the different stone walls and floors, they could be used in different adventure sites, in mines, in underground dungeons and lairs, in different castles and mansions. So this is a product that you will use throughout the course of your entire RPG career. You even have some tiles featuring the outside area or the house grounds, different annexes, stables. You even have like a graveyard, a carriage house, some vehicles, furniture, room items as well. That's what I like of these add-ons. There will be people who will want to get them just because of the value they bring to the tabletop experience, to use them in other adventures and campaigns besides the Dread House. And if you want more things to enhance your tabletop, I recommend that you check out the Hammer Dog website for some miniatures. They have miniatures for furniture and for some of the monsters of the Dread House, so go take a look if you're looking for that. Now let's talk about the screen inserts for the Game Master screen. This surprised me quite a bit because they are actually useful even if you are not running the Dread House. Something that could be considered a weakness perhaps, or something that is lacking in many screen inserts, is that they only serve for a particular adventure module or campaign and that's it. But these inserts will be useful in any horror adventure, especially those that feature ghosts. You do have some Dread House specific information, like for example the universal map key, with the differences of scales between 5 and 10 feet depending on the type of map that you are running, because the Dread House will be played in medieval fantasy times and modern times. The scale will change related to something that I will talk about later on. You also have the symbols for the map featuring the doors, secret doors, windows, but what gives a lot of reusability or replay value to these screen inserts are the tables contained. You have tables for curious objects that you could find in the shelves or bookshelves of a haunted house. Like for example, you see that all the books on the shelf are mundane, or maybe there are some special books, perhaps containing important information that will serve as a clue to solve the adventure. In personal shelves you could find grooming materials, or perhaps a keepsake, or maybe dolls. Dolls are always mysterious and creepy in haunted houses. You also have tables for curious objects that you could find in food lockers, dressers and armoires. Like for example, you could find a ring box, or maybe a journal, or some mysterious object wrapped up in cloth. It could be hard cheese, or it could be a blood-stained dagger. You also have a table featuring objects and dressing in a haunted house in general. Maybe you find a burlap sack, or maybe a jar of sulfur, and the air is hazy, or maybe there are cobwebs, or maybe the walls bleed, a typical feature of haunted houses. You also have a table of dread apparitions with sounds and sensations. Maybe you hear the roar of a bear, or maybe you feel an electrical wave passing slowly by, or maybe birds chirp serenely from beneath the floor. You could also find incense, flowers, the smell of cinnamon or garlic. You also have a table featuring manifestations. I will talk about those later on because they are related to dread ghosts, a very powerful form of ghost within the dread house. So maybe you could see a harmless animal, or maybe some winged things like sturges or gargoyles. Or maybe you see zombies, or maybe spirits. Maybe you bump into a mass of dread worms, or maybe you find hounds of hell, or creatures from beyond. You also have a table featuring a dread ghost generator. Maybe you find a dread ghost in its corporeal or incorporeal form, or maybe you find a single body part or some sort of wisp. You can also determine the purpose of the dread ghost. Maybe the dread ghost wants to fight the group or harm the group, or actually give some useful information. There could be some ghostly allies. You also have information on what the ghost is wearing. Maybe it's dressed in night clothes or formal wear or rags. You also have a table with more dread ghost generators. Maybe you hear tapping on the door or on the wall. Maybe a pen stands up by itself and starts writing on a book. It reminds me of that scene in Corpse Party, the video game. Really creepy. You could also see some moving objects. You also have information how to destroy these different ghosts and manifestations and apparitions. Maybe you need to bury the remains of the ghost, or maybe put it at ease through something that soothes the ghost, like its favorite story or some sort of music. You also have information on what the ghost is carrying. Maybe the ghost is carrying an object related to its death, or maybe it's carrying its own head or skull. You also have a bird's eye view of the house grounds and the house itself. This is going to be useful, especially when the group is moving around, because this is a complex adventure. It's not difficult to run thanks to the great organization, but there is some complexity that it sometimes feels a bit like a sandbox, and you need to keep track of what the player characters are doing within the different zones and areas, and this map is going to be very useful to track that. You also have information on non-player characters of the villagers in the Dread Wedding. You also have dread effects related to the Dread House, of course, when there is a storm going on, and I will talk about dread storms and the Hell Shift, which is quite interesting later on in this review. You also have information on the aura of darkness and disease in the house. The house has some very nasty effects that are placed on the group. It's sort of like a cursed blanket of sorts that covers the entire area of the house and the grounds. You even have some really nice looking panels featuring the house when it's in its normal or dormant state and when the Hell Shift happens. I can't wait to tell you about the Hell Shift. You also have some images of the non-player characters the characters could find. Some of them could be allies, some of them could be enemies, and they really help to set up the mood for the adventure. So in general, I would recommend that you get these add-ons. The music is really nice, but I think the ones that are going to be especially useful are going to be the printable tiles and the screen inserts. There are so many things about these two add-ons that make them universal in its use. And within the Dread House book, you even have an example of an adventure that is not related to the Dread House. This is one of the standalone adventures, although you can find a way to connect it to the main storyline. It uses the tiles in different ways, displaying the versatility of the arrangements that you can create with the printable tiles. Now let's talk about the Dread House book. Let's start with the quality. My only criticism of the quality is that it doesn't have bookmarks and it's not hyperlinked. So it's going to be difficult to navigate the entire PDF, and this is a big PDF. It's 290 pages. So in digital format, it's going to be difficult to move around. However, the organization of the document is great, considering this is a set of adventures and encounters that at many times they feel a bit like a sandbox type of experience, even though it's within the Dread House and the grounds around it. Because the house and the grounds are so big, it almost feels more like a grand mansion or a castle. The player characters are going to be moving around quite a bit. The situation could potentially go off rails in many times, considering there is some interdimensional traveling. I will talk about that later on. And because you also play this in different ages, the organization is quite superb, all things considered. You even have different adventures categorized with an overview on specifics such as the duration of an adventure, the types of experiences that the player characters will go through the adventure, the basic plotline. So if you're looking for an adventure that fits a specific time frame, maybe you don't have too much time to play, or you want to build a small campaign or a large campaign, and you want to cut and paste different adventures and encounters from the D.READ HOUSE, you can do that quite easily thanks to this categorization and organization. The document in its entirety is very well written and explained. I think I only found like a couple of typos, and that's pretty good considering it's 290 pages. The illustrations are perfect for the theme. They look moody, mysterious. Some of them could be considered quite scary. Some of them look slightly comical, because there are some encounters within the D.READ HOUSE that feel a bit like a horror comedy, and in contrast, some of them potentially nightmarish. Another small criticism is that there are these blue boxes with additional information, like sidebars, and I think the white font on them fades a bit into the background, so it's not exactly difficult to read, but could be slightly annoying. There aren't too many of these text boxes though. So overall, the quality is pretty good. Now let's talk about the contents. The book starts with a couple of introductions. One by the author, Danny O'Neill, in which he shares his general inspiration behind the creation of the D.READ HOUSE. And this is great. I'm always interested in knowing about the designer's perspective behind a module or a role-playing game, etc. Then you have a general introduction. And with this initial part of the D.READ HOUSE, you start to get a good idea of what this module is all about. You have a couple of campaigns, the Dread Wedding and Beyond the Veil. The Dread Wedding happens in fantasy medieval times, and the Beyond the Veil campaign starts during the Roaring Twenties and a bit further beyond that throughout the years. There are also standalone adventures that could be integrated in any of these two campaigns, and some of them actually place the action in present times and even in the near future. So if you wanted to play a haunted sci-fi experience, there is an adventure that features such a scenario. There is also a prequel campaign known as the Science of Solaria. This serves as a prequel for the Dread Wedding. This is an optional campaign, but it certainly enhances the entire experience of the Dread Wedding. I recommend that you use it, and it extends the duration of the campaign as well. There is a lot of customization and flexibility when it comes to the time in real time that you will take to play these couple of campaigns. For example, the D.READ HOUSE can be played as a single night experience in game time. That is, in the campaign setting where you are basing this adventure, it's only going to take one night to complete the storyline or solve it. That's one option. And in real time, maybe it will take you 3 or 4 sessions, perhaps more. It depends on how you're going to play it. There is even an option of turning the entire Dread Wedding affair into a dungeon crawl, a grindhouse, sort of gauntlet type of experience where the player characters are moving from room to room, fighting all sorts of ghastly creatures. In that mode, the ghosts are modified to focus completely on combat. So that's one way of running the D.READ HOUSE. It's fun, but I think it's a lot more enjoyable if you play it as it is intended, as a somewhat moody or slow-paced adventure as a mystery unravels, and then the pacing of the encounters becomes a bit more frantic near the climax of the entire campaign. You could also play the Dread Wedding as a 3-night type of experience, that is 3 nights in the campaign setting, but it could also take several sessions in the real world. It depends on how many times a month you gather to play. Let's say that a normal group, not so hardcore, gathers to play 2 or 3 times per month, then it will probably take a few months to complete this type of experience, but there are some moments, some instances in which the player characters could take things dramatically off rails, especially during the Hell Shift and their interactions with the people in the village that serves as a hub for the Dread Wedding. So you never know. I think some groups, if they play it as a, let's say, 3-night experience, They could well extend it to 6 months. It depends on how much they interact with the non-player characters in the village, how much they want to explore of the Dread House. Not all of the rooms need to be explored to solve the adventure, but I think there is a lot of richness to be experienced if you decide to explore the entirety of the house and the grounds and the village as well. And there is another way to further extend the Dread Wedding, and it's by adding the Scions of Solaria prequel campaign. There are many ways in which you can take encounters and adventures from a particular campaign and place it in another, or use it as a sort of connection between the two campaigns. Even with the future campaign of Beyond the Veil that happens in the 20s and beyond, you can also use some encounters, interchange them between the different campaigns. So I'd say that if you were to take the Dread Wedding and combine it with the Scions of Solaria and play it as an extended campaign where effectively the whole Dread Wedding affair takes more than just a few nights, you could well extend this to a year and a half. It's quite possible. And as I was saying, when the Hell Shift happens, it could take even longer. And if you were to combine this whole thing with the Beyond the Veil campaign, while adding all of these standalone adventures, connecting them as some sort of group of side quests or connecting quests, you could well extend this to 2 years or more. So there is a lot of value in the entirety of the Dread House. The book explains its approach towards ghosts. They are handled as those ghosts that you would see in movies and legends with some pretty extraordinary abilities and powers. They are supposed to be scary ghosts, but they can also do anything. They almost seem at times like genies from out of a lamp that are almost capable of manipulating anything related to time and space. They are almost like fulfillers of wishes, instead that they are not fulfilling the player character's wishes, they are focused on their own designs and plans. This does not mean that the ghosts are too powerful or impossible to defeat. It means that you will need to think things through. Many ghosts can only be defeated by fulfilling certain conditions or destroying certain objects. Some you may need to outsmart. And there is a lot of useful information here that not only applies to this Dread House mega campaign, it also pretty much applies to any horror-themed adventure campaign. So they tell you how, for example, a haunted house feels more like a domesticated dungeon. It looks civilized on the outside, but it's as deadly as any abattoir that you may go into. In fact, there are some moments and many mechanisms to keep the player characters trapped inside the house during specific events. You also have information on how the haunted house is a storytelling device, and specific information on how to use this book, especially using it with one of the 3 systems, that is Pathfinder or 5th edition or Call of Cthulhu. The information is presented quite neatly and organized. At first I thought, or rather I wondered how the author was going to organize information concerning Pathfinder, 5th edition and Call of Cthulhu, but it's actually quite simple. The information is color-coded, pointing out combat information, anything related to, for example, sanity systems, thematic information as well. That is, if you're playing Pathfinder or 5th edition, you will find some standard monsters that you will expect to find in classic fantasy games or even high fantasy games. But when there is something that is radically different from what you would find in Call of Cthulhu, the difference is highlighted here. So when you would find some sort of fantasy undead creature, when you play Call of Cthulhu, that is changed to, for example, a flying polyp. And it works the other way around as well. When you find, for example, something related to Cthulhu, a Pathfinder or 5th edition replacement is suggested. But there is still a ton of flexibility. If there is something that the Dread House has, is flexibility and versatility. If you wanted to, you could use some Cthulhu related books like Sandy Petersen's Cthulhu Mythos. I'm going to put the link in the description below to a review that I did featuring that book. And in that way you could even introduce some Mythos related things to Pathfinder. Maybe you want the Dread House to have also some Eldritch horror there. You could use some Mythos supplement to do that. There are also suggestions on when to use a particular system for a campaign. Because, for example, the first part of the campaign, which is the Dread Wedding and the Scions of Solaria, it is recommended that you play them using Pathfinder or 5th edition. But if you want, you can also play them using Call of Cthulhu, but you will have to make some conversions so that the setting feels a bit more real, that is, that it happens in a fictional version of planet Earth. So you have some correspondences or recommendations on where to base the entire adventure. Maybe it's happening in Spain. There are many things that could be a reference to Spain, but it could also be based in Mexico. So you have things related, for example, to El Día de los Muertos or the Day of the Dead. And there are some books, mysterious books with perhaps clues, like Los Dioses Oscuros de España or the Dark Gods of Spain. So it's going to be very easy to set this in a medieval version of Call of Cthulhu. And the campaign that features the Roaring Twenties and the future, that is recommended to be played with Call of Cthulhu, but you could also play it using Pathfinder 5th edition, making some changes so that it's not in the Roaring Twenties. It could be also a medieval fantasy type of setting, but there are also many books, like for example Pathfinder settings featuring science fantasy, like Anachronistic Adventures or the Interface Zero for Pathfinder, or Pure Steam. You could use any of those settings that feature Pathfinder in more modern type of settings or near modern, or even science fiction settings that allow you to base the Pathfinder role-playing game in a modern to futuristic setting to feature the Roaring Twenties campaign. You would just need to make some adjustments, and even if you do not have those settings, there are also some core books in Pathfinder like Ultimate Combat that feature firearms, and you could also handle it like that. Because here you get some suggestions such as, when you find a pistol or a gun, just change it to a magic wand or some similar object. But with those books, you could leave things as they are and just make some minor tweaks. There's also information on the books that you will need to run this with Pathfinder or 5th edition or Call of Cthulhu. Mostly they are core books, but if there is a book that you do not have, remember that it's quite easy to replace some of the monsters. They actually make some suggestions or removing a particular part of an encounter. But you could also check out the free system reference document, for example for Pathfinder. You could find all of the information there. You also have tips on creating an immersive experience, such as sending out creepy invitations to your players, choosing the location, using props, controlling the lighting of the room, using music, how to build tension, play around with your players' fears, using terrain and miniatures, or playing in the theater of the mind. If you want to play this without grids and miniatures, it's quite possible to do so. You also have fiction, timelines, to further solidify the feeling or flavor of the D.READ house. And this timeline is also quite useful to connect both of the larger campaigns and the prequel campaign, of course, and with the standalone adventures as well. Remember what I said about the scale at the beginning of this adventure? It works like this. In the first part of the multi-part campaign, if you're going to play it like that, that is the D.READ Wedding and the Science of Solaria, because it's supposed to, by standard means, offer a more high fantasy experience. That is, if you're using Pathfinder or 5th edition, the scale is larger to represent bigger rooms so that combats become more tactically exciting or challenging. But when you play in the Roaring Twenties and after that, the scale is smaller. So you would find rooms of a more average size that you would find in modern constructions or sites. Now let's talk about how this D.READ house became such a cursed place. There was this powerful and righteous paladin known as Joseph Tashmir. He led a crusade against a force of evil known as the D.READ Lords. The D.READ Lords were quite demonic, with many undead and unholy powers at their service. So Tashmir led this successful crusade against them. He managed to vanquish them, but did not destroy them. So they still existed, they were licking their wounds, they were defeated, and were not very happy about that. So Joseph had this great house, practically a huge mansion, and he decided to host a wedding for one of his daughters. He invited all of his friends and family, and the wedding was set for a specific date. However, due to different setbacks, the date of the wedding happened in a day dedicated to death. And many warned Tashmir to change the date, but he would have none of it. his daughter would marry in that day that was supposed to be dedicated to death rather than life. It was a celebration of life, so the forces of the Dreadlords considered that a great insult, and they asked Death for power, help, and guidance. In a collaborative effort, they pulled all of their powers and created the Pumpkin Man, a supernaturally powerful being capable of bringing down an entire household in just one night. The Pumpkin Man crashed the household of the Tashmir just before the wedding took place, and in a single night killed everyone in there. The Pumpkin Man also summoned many ghastly, ghoulish, and unholy creatures into the house. These creatures would appear periodically, sometimes remaining semi-dormant, other times manifesting in their whole hellish glory. And this was not all. The Pumpkin Man had great control over a supernatural climate effect known as the Dread Storm. It is a terrible storm that encapsulates the entire area in a torrent through which you can actually see demons and devils flying up above in the clouds. This makes moving really difficult for flying creatures and player characters, and moving through the roads is also cumbersome and sometimes not viable. And then there's the matter of the hell shift. During certain astrological conditions, when the stars are right, the Dread House connects directly with hell. A sort of membrane enshrouds the entire house and the grounds around it, and it is this membrane that serves as a window to hell. If the player characters are not careful, they could become fascinated by this interaction or connection between the house and hell, and they could actually be pulled into the flames and destroyed forever. And if they are careful, the characters can actually make a jump into hell without dying and have further adventures there. Now, I forgot to mention something that could be considered not too good in terms of organization, and it's that the prequel campaign, Scions of Solaria, is actually placed after the Dread Wedding. Some could consider that out of place, but still I wouldn't consider it too much of a difficulty when running the entire multi-year campaign. Scions of Solaria is considered the direct prequel to the Dread Wedding. I would consider it the best way to explore the history and the site of the Dread House in its entirety, at least during the medieval fantasy period. In this mini-campaign, the player characters are chosen villagers from the village of Sorrenton. The entire village of Sorrenton and the non-player characters within it are finely detailed in the Dread House book. You could have many adventures before the Scions of Solaria if you wanted to, although the player characters would be children. The Scions of Solaria campaign starts with the player characters being early teenagers, but during the course of the campaign you could have some side quests related to the different non-player characters. So in the Scions of Solaria campaign, Madame Aluna, the town seer, has had a prophecy, a vision, in which the characters rid the Dread House from its curse, because since the curse of the Dread House, many villagers have gone missing and some have died because of the Dread Storm, because of the Hell Shift, and the entities and creatures that sometimes manage to find their way out of the Dread House, directly or indirectly, and you will see some examples as to why during this campaign of the Scions of Solaria. Now, an important detail that I think works in the campaign's favor is that the vision that Madame Aluna had was not entirely clear, so she's not completely certain that the player characters are the chosen ones to rid this house of the curse. And I think this is convenient because maybe one of the player characters dies during the campaign and you replace that character, and maybe you could say that it wasn't that character after all, the one that Madame Aluna saw in her vision, that it was someone else, perhaps the newly generated player character. So the first adventure for the teenagers that are supposed to rid this house of its evil is known as Talismans of Hope. A quick delve into the Dread House to collect a pair of items. This is a short adventure for levels between 1 to 3. At this time, the house is not entirely active. There is some paranormal activity within it, but it's relatively safe as long as you do not act foolishly. So this adventure is just supposed to be moody, not too scary, sort of like a preliminary advance or exploration or scouting of the house. So the player characters, because of their reputation that when they were much younger, they actually went into the house's grounds and even into the house itself for a while, they have been chosen, based on the prophecy, to enter the house and collect the book and the soul sword of Solaria. Solaria is the deity featured in the D.READ House. She is a deity of light. You have all her information in this book, but if you wanted to, you could replace her with one of the deities of your campaign setting, but I would still recommend that you use Solaria because everything is tailored around her representation of light, and she also brings an element of despair to the adventure because, or the campaign rather, because there were some things that went beyond her power to stop. So the young player characters will go into the house, do a bit of exploration. They will not find terrible ghosts in the different rooms. However, there is a chance that they will run into shadow stalkers, relatively weak ghosts and also wisps, but they are mostly there to scare the player characters, and if the player characters are smart and they use the soul sword of Solaria to drive them away, they can be relatively safe during the course of this adventure. Now let me give you a brief overview of what makes this adventure module so great, and it's related to the optional rules, which represents fear, sanity, and soul points. When it comes to fear, as the player characters experience different spooky and tenebrous moments during the course of the campaign, they will start to gain levels of fear. And because of these levels of fear, they will be less efficient and effective during different checks and actions. When it comes to sanity, this is handled differently if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, because Call of Cthulhu already has its own sanity system, but sanity with Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, it's basically a way in which you are losing sanity points where you face the most disturbing and maddening moments in the D.READ House. So your character will take some sanity related penalties, and there's also a risk of becoming insane. Now, soul points is an interesting mechanic. You basically have this resource that can be depleted through special effects and attacks of the dread ghosts and other beings within the house or outside and around it. And if you lose all of your soul points, your character will be doomed. And I will talk a bit more about specifics concerning these optional rules by the end of this review. But I really like these optional rules because the characters get into the mood of exploring a haunted house. They won't feel like it's going to be too easy to just run around from room to room. Sometimes they will want to keep on hiding and tiptoeing through the entire house grounds and inside the house. Resource management will have to be factored into the exploration of this house, specifically their sanity, their fear, and their soul. So maybe you usually have the paladin and the barbarian at the front, but what if the paladin accumulated too much damage in terms of soul points? So maybe the paladin has to step back for a bit, while the barbarian takes the front line or becomes the point man. But what if the barbarian starts to seeing all sorts of disturbing things? Maybe the barbarian can no longer go into certain rooms that have some ghastly scenes or apparitions or manifestations, and the player characters, maybe they want to go into that room, take care of the most disturbing things first, or perhaps cover some horrifying scenes up. Maybe there are corpses or any other disturbing element. That way the barbarian's sanity is preserved or guarded. And what if one of the characters accumulates too much fear? They will have to rest in different places so that he recovers and can keep moving forward, exploring the different rooms and zones. So there are ways to recover from fear and from taking sanity damage or soul damage. They are different and specific depending on the type of damage that you have taken. But this also adds an element of fear to the players in real life. They will start to fear for their characters. And it's not as annoying, for example, as level drain. So now the characters are gaining negative levels. The party may decide to rest for a bit in a certain zone or safe house or camp that they create within the grounds just to recover for a little, and perhaps some other characters want to scout while the other members recover, especially if you're on a time limit. Some adventures, some missions could have an element of time related to them. So they will need to strategize. The party of adventurers will need to decide if they want to take the risk of taking a chance with their sanity, their fear, and their soul in order to finish a mission a bit more quickly. Or if they are being pursued by one of the beings inside the house, they will have to find some good hiding spots. So hopefully the player characters will recover the book and the soul sword, and they will be praised by the entire village. And now they will be tasked with the next mission, which happens sometime later. All of these quests and missions happen throughout the years. You will see your characters growing older until they finally become adults. The next quest is the Dark Garden, a fight to the death against a vegetative plant menace. So in this adventure the mood is of classic horror, and there's actually a dire threat. There is a good chance of getting a total party kill here. On this occasion, the group is hired by Madame Aluna to gather black mandrakes from the old garden of the D.READ HOUSE. And they are harvested at night, so they will have to go into the house at its most dangerous time. And they will have to fight against ghosts that are animating the plant life within the house's grounds. So they will have to survive an encounter with the Dark Seed and pumpkin mites. These animated plant monsters have a trick to them. They cannot be defeated just by attacking without thinking or strategizing. The player characters will have to figure out that there is some connection between the different monsters and think of some quick tactics to exploit that connection. If they do not do this, they will either have to flee from the encounter or die a horrible death. The important thing is that they get the black mandrakes, so maybe they can figure out some other way to reach their objective while escaping unharmed. There is an adventure that could happen during the course of some other adventure, and this is the Queen of the Cats. This is a supernatural encounter with a ghostly cat and her thralls. While the Dark Garden is appropriate for characters between levels 2 and 4, the Queen of the Cats is an adventure that could happen at any time because there is very little combat involved. It almost feels more like a dummy combat of sorts. This is appropriate for levels between 1 to 5 or any type of level, and it's quite light-hearted. You could even play this adventure with children if you want to introduce them to role-playing games in a scary way. This is the best way to do it. In this adventure, the group meets a ghost cat, either inside of the house or in the grounds of the house. And this cat has been quite bored. This is one of the cats that died during the initial assault from the Pumpkin Man. And this cat wants to play a game with the player characters. This ghostly cat will act appropriately spooky and will separate into several cats that will start to hide all over the house and the grounds. The player characters may want to give chase to these different cats after being challenged by the Queen of Cats, because if they capture the different ghostly cats, they will get a good luck bonus, allowing rerolls in their favor whenever they want to in future adventures or during an ongoing adventure. And they could also get a bad luck bonus, and this also works in the character's favor. This basically forces the game master to reroll and keep the result that the players want. So this works in favor of the player characters and against their enemies. They could also get some weird effects. It all depends on the color of the cat that they capture. Maybe the character's hair turns the same color as the cat's, or maybe the player character gains cat-like vision. That could also be somewhat effective. Once the characters finish the game with the Queen of Cats, she will attack them, but it's most like a playful attack. If they manage to strike a hit, which is relatively easy, she will actually transform into a normal black cat, and if she is taken as a pet, she will actually be able to sense undead nearby. As the time passes and now the characters are older teens, it's the perfect time for a slasher type of encounter, like a slasher film. So the Harrowing Hunter is the best adventure for that. It's a desperate battle to survive a ghostly stalker on the grounds of the D.READ HOUSE. So this is a tribute to all of those slasher films, especially Friday the 13th. So this is an adventure for levels between 3 to 5. It's a micro adventure and it needs to feel like a slasher film. While the characters are exploring the house, they will be chased around by Jason Kruger. I kid you not, that's his name, Jason Kruger, like Jason and Freddy Krueger. So this is a very powerful entity that wields an axe, and he cannot be killed unless they do a special thing. Every time the player characters kill this homicidal ghost, it's going to regenerate. They need to destroy a totemic pile of corpses so that he is defeated for good. The Game Master will have a lot of fun chasing the characters around, perhaps forcing them to take fear or sanity damage depending on what they see and experience, but as long as they realize that the totemic pile needs to be destroyed, they have a good chance of surviving this threat. Later on we have another adventure. This adventure could actually happen while the characters are being chased around by Jason, and this adventure is known as The Sweep and the Raven, a light-hearted magical adventure on the rooftops of the D.READ HOUSE. This is an adventure appropriate for levels between 3 to 5, and it's also a micro-adventure. This is a family ghost story. The mood is light, filled with wonder. It's slightly scary, but not exactly as terrifying. It's more like a mild fairy tale type of way. So in this adventure, the group meets with a friendly ghost, the ghost of a female chimney sweep. This friendly ghost, by the name of Ellison, has been pushed around by this tyrannical ghost by the name of the Raven Queen. She was also a chimney sweeper once, but she started bossing around everyone to the point that all of the other chimney sweepers went away. They did not want to work with her anymore, and only Ellison remained. So she is still giving nonsensical orders to Ellison, trying to rule over her, and the player characters may want to help her and confront this Raven Queen. If they manage to defeat the Raven Queen and become friends with Ellison, she will actually help them against the Pumpkin Man in battle. The next adventure that follows up is the Good Hound adventure, an exciting race around the grounds at the behest of a ghostly hound. It's for character levels between 3 and 5. It's a micro adventure that it's somewhat short, although this adventure can be connected with other adventures, even providing clues and aids for the player characters if they get stuck during different times. So the group meets this ghostly hound named Hero, and he starts to guide them. He was actually a very heroic dog in life. He tried to protect the members of the Tashmir household, but he was killed. So now this dog has an opportunity to further serve the cause by defeating the leader of a ghost hound pack. This alpha can be defeated if the heroes help Hero in the endeavor, and so Hero will become the new leader of the ghost hounds. It's somewhat tragic and it could be considered a cursed condition, but if the player characters manage to solve the mystery of the D.READ House, they can also free Hero from that fate. Then we have the Dread Butcher. This is a battle for survival against a horrific ghost-enhanced human. This is for levels between 3 to 5. It's a micro-adventure too. It takes place in a butcher's barn. This adventure should feel like a monster movie. And there is this butcher. He's not exactly a bad person, but he foolishly went into the house's territory, and he ended up possessed by a crazed butcher. So now he is killing people, and the player characters need to somehow defeat him while managing to rescue him. When the player characters become near adults, they will take on a very dangerous mission, the Bride's Carriage. This is a terror-filled ride through hell at the mercy of a possessed carriage. This is for levels between 4 to 6. It's also a short adventure, and it takes place on the grounds of the D.READ House, but also beyond. The mood is dangerous and exciting. There is this hellish carriage of sorts that can actually produce tentacles out of it, and if the player characters run into it, it will pull them inside of its own body, of the carriage that is. So it will start to ride violently at high pace. It's going to race through the house's grounds and the woods and even through hell itself. It's supposed to feel as if the player characters are on a roller coaster, but without any sort of protection. So they will take damage from the ride, and they will also suffer sanity damage potentially and other types of damage depending on the things that they encounter. And when they cross into hell, they will have to fight hounds of hell, all sorts of demons like winged demons, a giant demoness. So this is a very dangerous ride. Maybe the characters will manage to survive it, and we'll move on from the Science of Solaria prequel campaign to the Dread Wedding campaign. And the Dread Wedding is a very big and dangerous adventure. It can be handled as a single night adventure that is in game time, but also as a 3-day type of affair. If you didn't play the Science of Solaria prequel campaign, it is better handled as a 3-day campaign in my opinion, because it takes encounters from the Science of Solaria and distributes them throughout the 3 days of the campaign. but it could also be played as a multi-year campaign using the prequel Science of Solaria campaign, and perhaps also adding standalone adventures, and you could even connect it with the Roaring Twenties Beyond the Veil campaign. Because the entire thing covers the house grounds and the house itself and the area around it, it's going to feel a lot like a sandbox. The player characters are almost free to go in any direction that they want and interact with the different non-player characters, so it's going to be quite unpredictable and exciting at the same time. You have a time frame of how the events will proceed, and very easy to adjust this series of events depending on how you want to handle the campaign. So for example, the player characters are supposed to be traveling towards Sorrenton unless they are already there in that village as the Science of Solaria, and they will start to interact with the non-player characters, and they will find out more about the curse of the Dread House. Later on, the Captain Radek will try to organize a group to carry out an assault against the Dread House and solve the problem once and for all. So the player characters are supposed to go on with this, or maybe they want to strike out on their own, but it is advisable that they go along with the captain, and they could actually recruit some non-player characters to help them, perhaps by receiving some sort of items, or maybe the non-player character will be convinced to come with them in the expedition. So later on they will go into the grounds, and they can go in any direction from there. It's important that they explore the correct rooms by gathering clues, by interacting with some friendly ghosts. For example, they could encounter Christina, the ghostly daughter of Yasef Tashmir. This is the youngest daughter, the one who is not going to get married, and she at first needs to see if she can trust the player characters. Once they win her trust, Christina will start to fill them in on what happened in the Dread House, or at least help them to make sense of things, and warn them of the Pumpkin Man, who will be a presence of horror and will try to harass the player characters through the adventure, through its creations and its control over the Dread Storm. Because the Pumpkin Man has complete control over the Dread Storm, as I said, traveling could be somewhat difficult if the player characters are moving around the grounds, and also if they are using some sort of flying spell or item, that could also prove difficult. The ghost of Christina is definitely the best ally that the characters can have in the Dread House. She is going to guide them as to the items that they need, because they need to recreate the wedding that never happened during that fatal day. So if they gather the appropriate items and they allow one powerful ghost, a priestess of Solaria, to possess one of them, they will have a final showdown with the Pumpkin Man. This trek through the entire house is going to be somewhat difficult. There are moments where you could get a total party kill if you are not careful. You never feel safe in the corridors and the rooms of the house, especially when the hell shift occurs, where everything starts to become even worse. The entire house and the grounds are under the effects of a zone of dread, so there is an aura of fear that makes it more difficult to resist terrifying situations. There's also an aura of hunger that keeps all the characters hungry at all times, no matter how much they eat. There's also an aura of nightmares. You cannot rest within the grounds of the Dread House. There's an aura of madness that makes it difficult to resist insanity-related effects. There's also aura of Petersens. Vermin are attracted to the house. So there are many ways in which you can mess around with the player characters, make them feel in a constantly hostile environment, and this becomes even worse as the night goes on. I definitely recommend that you print this PDF or that you make some notes, because the player characters, because they have so much freedom to move between the different rooms and zones and areas, you can never predict where they are going to be, and you will need to quickly page through different encounters to read the descriptions of the different rooms, the different red ghosts. Thankfully, as I said, the organization is really good in that regard, in telling you the details of all of the rooms and encounters. You also have information on the house mechanics, persistent effects, such as, for example, the house is invulnerable to fire. It has a fire resistance. You can damage some of the house, but it has damage regeneration, so that plan will not work against the house. And you also have effects such as aura of darkness. It's very difficult to see inside the house. The level of brightness is reduced. There's also an aura of disease, of undeath. If anyone dies in the house, it will become an undead enemy later on. So those player characters that die will add to the army of the house, so to speak. I also like it that because, for example, of the dread ghosts and the different effects, the game master can make the house as difficult or as easy as he wants it for his group. Maybe he has a somewhat small group. He could keep things as they are or make them slightly easier if you consider it so. But if you have like a very powerful and large group of adventurers, it's very easy to turn up the difficulty, adding perhaps additional random encounters with dread ghosts. Thanks to the Game Master screen insert, you have a table to generate such encounters. And there is even a really good feature to continue the Dread House after the characters have cleared it. Maybe they already fought the Pumpkin Man during the recreation of the wedding that never happened, the Dread Wedding, but the Pumpkin Man decides to kidnap the ghost of Christina. So now the player characters have a year to prepare, to get stronger, and fight the horrors of the house once more. You could consider it, oh, but this doesn't make too much sense, or it's anti-thematic, but this is sort of like a tribute to, for example, those video games like in Castlevania, where you have to go back into Dracula's castle when things are a bit more difficult. Because, as I told you, there is a mode of play for the Dread House known as the Fall of the House Tashmir. This is basically a meat grinder or dungeon crawl version of the Dread House, where it's more like a gauntlet, focused more on combat and getting from one place to another. As a sort of New Game Plus or the Dread House on Inferno difficulty, the player characters could enter once more this dreadful place. The Game Master could set things up as a meat grinder or gauntlet type of situation in which the characters are racing through the house trying to rescue Christina and defeat the Pumpkin Man and the threat of the Dreadlords, perhaps once and for all. Following that, we have a standalone adventure, The Sinister Secret of Pepper Marsh. This is unrelated to the events in the Dread House, but if you wanted to, you could add it as a side quest. It wouldn't be difficult. So this is an homage to a classic that might have been. So this is a medium duration adventure for characters between level 1 to 3, and the adventure takes place in a small haunted house on the edge of a cliff. The cliff overlooks a bay that leads to a nearby ocean. The mood is spooky, fun, with a dose of real danger, and there is somewhat of a tragedy in this adventure. There was this group of smugglers that took control of this abandoned house, and they were carrying out their operations there while setting things up to make it seem as if the house was haunted. However, the villagers got a bit nervous about that and they hired adventurers to look into things. These adventurers were quite overzealous and not very intelligent, and they went into this house with murderous intent. These smugglers didn't want to kill anyone. They were still conducting illegal activities, but they did their best to avoid harming people. So these adventurers went in and they slaughtered the entire group of smugglers. So now that they are dead, they became restless spirits. So the adventurers need to go into this house and find a way to appease the spirits, because although they did some things wrong, they weren't as terrible as to deserve total annihilation. So this adventure shows you different ways in which you can arrange the tiles for the Dread House. It displays the versatility of the printable tiles, and it's a great way to build your own adventures using the material from the Dread House, either the tiles, the Game Master insert, or the material contained in this book. Because as I said, all of the other materials that are obtained separately are just optional. Following that, we have a very cool campaign, the Beyond the Veil Roaring Twenties campaign. This campaign is more suitable for Call of Cthulhu, although you have all the information to play it as a Pathfinder or 5th edition experience. When compared to the Dread Wedding campaign, Beyond the Veil feels a lot more freeform and open-ended, and not too focused on combat. There are some combat encounters, but rather it's focused on roleplay, problem solving, and exploration and investigation, of course. You have a new adventure hub, which is the town of Middleburg. You have all the information, the population, the non-player characters, all of the location. If you wanted to create several huntings around the entire area, you could do that and the characters could come back to the town and rest and recover. Or maybe they will take on different assignments and quests and missions given by the non-player characters, not necessarily horror related. If you wanted to, you could combine this adventure with other non-horror related adventures while still keeping things with an underlying theme of horror. And like I said at the beginning, even though this is focused on Call of Cthulhu, You could easily use Pathfinder or 5th edition as if it were a medieval setting by making the necessary adjustments, but like I said before, you could also use some of the more modern or science fiction or science fantasy oriented settings for Pathfinder. So how did the D.READ house get all the way from back in the past to a more modern setting? It's also featured on a different land. That's because parts of the D.READ house were taken and used in recreation or reconstruction of the D.READ house, but not exactly, it's not exactly the same. There's a new configuration for the rooms, the corridors, and the events that took place during the D.READ wedding are almost forgotten. There are just some small references to the past, but it's more focused on the recent problems that the inhabitants of the house have been experiencing. Some of them have actually died inside the house, so there are new spirits. It seems like the D.READ house is damned to serve as a sort of magnet for paranormal activity. So now the player characters will have to take on more modern spirit-related problems, while there is still a hint of the curse of the past. All of these modern adventures can also be played as standalone type of experiences. In fact, you could even create different player characters for each one of the adventures, but you also have information on how to connect them as a sort of campaign as well. But I think it's much better if it is played as a campaign and you see how your characters grow older with the passing of the years as they try to solve the curse of the modern D.READ house once and for all. And this also takes into consideration the scaling that I mentioned, that now the D.READ house feels a bit smaller, a bit more realistic and modern in its layout. And during this campaign, most of the campaign, the characters will not have the support of the law. They do not consider the house to be a threat, so during many occasions the characters will have to find a way to go into the house unnoticed as they carry out their investigations. The first adventure is called Piercing the Veil. This is a short chase as the group tries to escape from the haunted house. The basic premise is that the investigators are called to participate in a seance in this abandoned house that we all know that is haunted, and things will not go so well. The restless spirits of the house will be unleashed upon the participants of the seance, and the characters will have to escape if they want to save their lives. The next adventure, 13 Ghosts, is a spooky treasure hunt featuring a power struggle between ghosts. This is an adventure that is of short duration, and I forgot to mention that most of the adventures in this campaign are for lower levels, that is levels between 1 to 3. And there is real danger for the player characters to become insane in this adventure if they are not careful. They are tasked with finding missing money that was hidden in this house by a group of robbers known as the 13 Guns. This gang wanted to hide from the law inside the house, but they found their demise within it, and now form part of the multitude of ghosts that haunt the place. So the player characters need to negotiate a little with the spirits within the house while keeping their sanity in check. The next adventure is called The Tome of the Dead. This is a classic battle against a scourge of zombies. This is a short adventure featuring a non-player character that wants to get her hands on an ancient tome. The player characters could be hired to accompany her, and they will have to infiltrate the house carefully because they are not allowed to do so. Once they get inside and they start messing around with the book, they will unleash a curse of zombies. So this is a zombie survival type of situation, and you even have tips on how to use it, for example, if you want to insert it into the D.READ wedding campaign. Next we have The Machine Man, a harrowing adventure against a powerful ghost machine. Another short adventure. It features a scientist that hires the player characters to go with him and explore under the house's grounds to find an automaton that he believes to be built by one of the previous members of the house, Jack Cardell. This is actually a very lethal adventure. This is also supposed to feel like a slasher film, with running away from the possessed automaton being an excellent choice or course of action. The player characters could also try to fight him, but sometimes you should look for alternatives. As the threat of the D.READ house is exposed, the player characters will start to work with officials. So in Ghost Catchers, a dangerous but fun-filled romp through the world's most haunted house, this is basically a short adventure that feels a lot like Ghostbusters. The group is given a machine that can absorb ghosts, and they are asked to use it. When they go into the house and start to hunt down the apparitions, they will actually have to fight against a giant possessed teddy bear sort of enemy. And there is a moment, I don't remember if it's in this adventure or in the others, where the player characters are equipped with walkie-talkies. And they actually give you a way to modify this if you are using Pathfinder or 5th edition, to have sort of like magical or possessed communication dolls that they use instead of the walkie-talkies, and I think that's a really nice touch. So in this occasion, the player characters will have to hunt down the ghosts, but unless there is some other thing that changes the outcome, it's more likely that the entire house will explode during this adventure. Next we have Dread Secrets. This is a deadly quest in the basement of a haunted house that leads to unparalleled horror. This is an adventure of medium duration. This is in the basement of the ruins of the old Cardell house. There are still some ghostly manifestations going on around the ruins, so the player characters are tasked with investigating the underground of the house and finding out what exactly is the cause. Here they can actually encounter a shard of Cthulhu. They are given the appropriate fantasy substitutions if you are using Pathfinder or 5th edition, but as I said at the beginning, maybe you could use Sandy Petersen's Cthulhu Mythos for Pathfinder and take some things from there to come up with your own version of Pathfinder or 5th edition Shard of Cthulhu. And that adventure concludes the Beyond the Veil campaign. Following that, we have the standalone adventure called Stay the Night, a heart-stopping challenge to win a haunted house. This is a short adventure that happens in present times. The investigators hear about a contest based around a supposedly haunted house, and they decide to enter. They need to spend the night without running out in terror. There have actually been deaths, heart attacks caused by fear, by the ghost within this house. Now I remember, this is the adventure where you use the walkie-talkies. They are given walkie-talkies to communicate during the contest, and the game master can actually produce some scary and ominous sounds through the walkie-talkies. And if you are playing this adventure using the Pathfinder role-playing game or 5th edition, this is where you swap the walkie-talkies for a more fantasy-appropriate way of communication in the form of those hunted dolls that I was telling you about. So you use those devices to communicate, but some creepy noises could come out of them. There is actually no combat in this adventure. However, there is real danger of being scared out of your wits or becoming insane, because there is this powerful ghost known as Ezekiel. It is a ghastly apparition. The limbs of these ghosts actually work on their own. They appear one by one, and they start to scare the player characters until Ezekiel finally comes together in a sort of parody of himself. The limbs will never become fully attached to his body, so it's a terrifying apparition that will chase down the player characters. Because of this, the success of this adventure depends on the characters investigating, gathering information and clues beforehand so that they have better chance to survive the frightful effects of Ezekiel. I think this is a great adventure to be used if you want to give the player characters a base of operations, because they will win the house if they confront Ezekiel, and if they manage to stand their ground against him, he will be exorcised and the house will belong to the player characters. Then we have a standalone adventure that I think is the less structured and more freeform of the adventures contained in this book. It's Geist in the Gears. A fun evening in a futuristic escape room turns dangerously real. This is perfect to use it on a science fiction type of setting, or even cyberpunk. Maybe you're using Interface Zero for Pathfinder. You could place this adventure on that setting. And this is basically a futuristic funhouse that recreates the Dread House in a holographic type of way. So at first the player characters are just going to be people that are looking for a fun time in the Dread House, in this modern recreation of the Dread House. It's for levels between 6 to 8, so it's a bit more dangerous. And during the attraction, a spirit of the Dread House will take control of the holograms produced within the attraction, and now the characters will actually be within a real Dread House with real dangers. So you can handle this in several ways. This could be a sort of like introduction or prelude to the Dread Wedding campaign, but there is a lot of freedom as how you can handle this. If you wanted to, you could create a more difficult and different version of the Dread House, or you could use it to run the dungeon crawl or grindhouse version of the Dread House in a more difficult and hellish way. It's all up to you. I think some will either love or hate this adventure. Those that want a bit more structure and more step-by-step type of adventure process will probably not like it too much, but those that want to play around with a loose framework will probably love it. At the end of the book, we have the appendices featuring the optional rules. First, we have the rules concerning fear. They work in harmony with the rules of Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder, and 5th edition. And if, for example, you don't have supplements featuring horror rules like Pathfinder Horror Adventures, don't worry. The complete rules for fear in the D.READ HOUSE do not need that supplement, although it works in harmony with those rules. So basically you have levels of fear. The more levels of fear that you gain by failing checks will pile on your character, applying different penalties. If you get too many levels of fear, your character will become horrified. They will stand still, flat-footed and helpless, and stunned for a number of rounds. So it is recommended that you do not move carelessly through the grounds of the D.READ HOUSE. You do not start to face off against all of the horrors within it, that you take some short rests and work towards eliminating the cause of a particular fear before moving on, otherwise the fear will stay with you. When it comes to the sanity system, Call of Cthulhu handles it as it normally would, but Pathfinder and 5th edition has a system of ways in which you can lose sanity points by knowing things that man was not supposed to know, by witnessing mind-shattering effects and encounters and enemies, or maybe some attacks cause insanity. So you will start to lose your sanity points, and you must be mindful of this to recover them by resting, overcoming obstacles, completing missions, receiving magical or conventional aid or care. But if your character is not careful, you're going to become insane or mad. You also have soul points. Some enemies deal soul damage. You will need to make a saving throw. Instead of negative energy damage, you will start to lose a part of your spirit. It will be drained. And if you lose all of your spirit points, you will die immediately. So even if a player character has all of his or her hit points, they could still be at risk if they have taken too much soul damage. These soul points can also be restored or recovered by resting, by receiving healing from healing spells, getting morale effect boosts, and similar things. You also have clarifications as to how effects such as ghost touch work within the D.READ HOUSE, and more information on D.READ ghosts, the types of ways in which you can defeat them, their abilities, how they choose their victims. They are always targeting specific characters within the group. So if you manage to quickly identify that a particular ghost is attacking a specific member in the group, perhaps by draining soul points, you could keep that member aside in some way, protect him through a spell perhaps, while the other members attack that ghost, keeping that character safe. You also have information on how to scale a D.READ ghost, how to make it a bit more difficult or easier. As I said, that's very useful to customize the difficulty of the different campaigns or standalone scenarios. You also have information on how they could appear corporeally or incorporeally, their purpose and appearance. Basically, everything that I mentioned in the Game Master insert is contained here in the book, but the Game Master insert makes the job a lot easier when generating one of these D.READ ghosts. You also have example pre-generated D.READ ghosts to use in any of the adventures in this book or beyond, and they are very useful to use in any time or place for many different types of campaigns. And as expected, these D.READ ghosts are really powerful. They have all sorts of spells and abilities, and in the terms of Pathfinder and 5th edition, all sorts of feats as well, causing physical damage, all sorts of status effects, draining soul and sanity, causing fear. Some of them are able to stop time, some of them are able to possess objects. They are truly formidable opponents, and you have system-specific information to make things more clear as to how you can use them in Pathfinder, in 5th edition, in Call of Cthulhu. You also have new hazards. You have Banshee mushrooms that basically emit Banshee whales and drain soul points. There's also a type of green slime. There's also soul grubs, nasty creatures that can be found alone or in group. The green slime can deal acid damage or constitution damage, depending on whether your character is alive or if the creature is undead. You could perhaps use the green slime in some way against the undead creatures found in D.READ HOUSE. And the soul grubs burrow into you, draining your soul. You also have some spells, such as Bond with Ghost. These are new spells. You also have Revive Spirit, Soul Bond, You have new magic items such as the Acorn Amulet, the Bone Scepter, the Eldritch Face Mask. And at the very end of the book, you have a really nice summary of all the important information to run the Dread House, sort of like a cheat sheet, but also the information for the non-player characters that you will find in the village of Sorenton, and the complete profile of the deity Solaria as well. So what do I think of the Dread House? First, the add-ons. The add-ons are excellent. They are definitely useful not only for running the entirety of the Dread House module, but also in all of your other horror-related adventures. The tiles can be arranged in so many different ways to represent any sort of cursed tower, haunted castle, enchanted mansion, etc. Although I do wish that pixelation was somehow fixed later on, it's still not that much of a big deal, but those that appreciate fine detail could consider it important. The music suite is very nice, presenting flexibility while at the same time telling the story of the Dread Wedding, producing that atmosphere of melancholy, of moodiness, fascination and danger. And when it comes to the inserts, I am surprised as to how handy they are. Even if you are not running the Dread House, the results generated could serve as inspiration for any type of system and any type of horror campaign. Especially those featuring ghosts and houses, mansions, castles, etc. And now, focusing on the Dread House module itself, I think this is the most flexible, multi-system campaign module that I have ever seen, because everything about it can be customized or can be played around with or tweaked to fit any sort of need for any group. If you want short adventures, you have short adventures here, or ways to shorten even an entire campaign such as the Dread Wedding. You have information, tips and advice on how to run the entire thing connected. It's also quite easy to use these standalone scenarios to insert them in the different campaigns, which are a total of 2 major campaigns, the Dread Wedding and the Beyond the Veil campaign, the mini campaign that serves as a prequel, that is the Science of Solaria. And it all depends on the group on how much juice they're going to get from this campaign. If they want to interact with all of the non-player characters, have all sorts of adventures and side quests, explore the adventure hubs, because you have 2 adventure hubs, the village of Sorenton and the town of Middleburg. This could turn into a massive campaign that could easily be extended for up to 2 years or more. And if you decide to go into hell when the hell shift occurs, or when you are riding that possessed carriage, if you decide to have that event where the campaign of the Dread Wedding extends because the Pumpkin Man was not yet defeated, you can also have further adventures in between the years as the events of the Dread Wedding and the Science of Solaria and even the Beyond the Veil happen. You could easily scale any of those adventures that follow up the precedent year, so that the player characters, if they gain some levels between those years, they still feel challenged. I think the modifications between the different systems, that is Pathfinder, 5th edition and Call of Cthulhu, work great. You never feel like, oh, this module is just focused on a particular system. All systems can work well with any of the standalone adventures or with any of the campaigns, or using them all as a sort of mega campaign. In many ways, this module feels a lot like a mega dungeon, although because you have different towns and different architectural states or configurations of the Dread House, when it's in the medieval fantasy time and it's supposed to be based on Europe if it's in a real world setting, and later on it's moved to America, the different configurations of the Dread House makes it feel new, not repetitive, and because it is not entirely focused on the events of the Dread Wedding that serve as a base for the curse or the hunting, when you experience the encounters with the new ghosts in the Roaring Twenties and beyond, it's also going to feel quite fresh, like a new experience while still having a hint of something that went really wrong in the past. There are also enough tips and information and advice on how to have adventures perhaps before or after the events of either of the campaigns or of the standalone adventures. So the Dread House is an amazing module, probably one of a kind. I certainly haven't seen a multi-system campaign module such as this, so customizable, regardless of the settings, time and place, So I highly recommend that you get the D.READ HOUSE. And in a few days it's going to be Halloween. It's going to be quite easy for you to pick up this module and perhaps use one of the standalone adventures, or the first adventure it was going to be a mega campaign. Or maybe if you want to shorten things a bit, you could just prepare to play the Dread Wedding as a single night experience or a 3-day type of experience. Although remember, because there are so many places and so many dangerous encounters in the D.READ HOUSE and many clues that you need to gather and objects to solve the campaign, it will be the start of a series of fun, dangerous and spooky sessions. Remember to check out the links in the description below. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.